The monotony of sieges, castles, rations, and waiting out the enemy. The long wait behind walls. The siege as a waiting game. When you hear the word siege, you might picture catapults hurling stones, ladders climbing castle walls, or desperate charges through fire and arrows. But the truth is that most sieges were far less dramatic. They were long, slow struggles of patience, boredom, and endurance. The attacking army rarely wanted to throw men at strong stone walls. Instead, they waited. The defenders, too, waited. Inside a fortress or walled town, daily life turned into a contest of survival. The real battle was not fought in sudden clashes, but in the ordinary routines of food, water, and morale stretched across weeks, months, or even years. Sieges, in their reality, were tedious affairs, where victory often went to whichever side could outlast the other. The routine of defenders. For the defenders inside a besieged castle or town, life shrank to simple necessities. Guards patrolled the walls, scanning the enemy camps. But they rarely saw action. Instead, they stared into the distance, counting the days. Food was rationed carefully. Bread grew stale, meat spoiled quickly, and salt fish became the common staple. Vegetables wilted, and fresh supplies vanished once the gates closed. Meals became repetitive and sparse. A hunk of bread, a little dried meat, perhaps watered-down ale. Luxury disappeared. Hunger gnawed slowly. Water was another concern. If the castle had a well inside, it could hold out longer. If not, cisterns filled with rainwater became lifelines. Every sip was precious. Defenders learned to drink less, stretch supplies, and accept thirst as a constant companion. Inside, households clustered together in cramped halls. Children cried from hunger, while craftsmen tried to stay busy repairing tools or weaving cloth. Monotony weighed heavily. Even the ringing of a church bell might provide a momentary break in endless days. The attackers' camp. Outside the walls, the attackers faced their own monotony. Armies built sprawling camps of tents, ditches, and wooden palisades. Soldiers cooked and shared pots, tended fires, and passed the time with dice or wrestling matches. Supplies were brought in from the countryside, often seized from local farms. Carts carried grain, barrels of ale, and salted meat. Foraging parties scoured villages, cutting off the defenders while feeding their own ranks. Time stretched. Soldiers sharpened weapons, repaired boots, or listened to orders that rarely changed. Only occasionally did excitement come, when sappers tunneled under walls or when siege engines rolled forward. But most days, life was waiting, like the defenders they encircled. Rations and hunger. Food was the deciding factor of most sieges. Defenders rationed carefully, yet famine was always close. Stories abound of towns where citizens ate horses, dogs, or even rats. Bread stretched with sawdust or ground acorns replaced wheat. Ale was watered until it barely resembled drink. Attackers, too, suffered shortages. If a siege dragged on too long, their supplies ran low. Armies depended on grain carts arriving on time, and disease could spread quickly in crowded camps. Dysentery, fever, and lice were as dangerous as enemy arrows. Hunger was shared, though the defenders always felt it more sharply. Disease and stench. Sieges bred filth. Inside castles, waste piled up as privies overflowed and garbage could not be removed. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and rot. Outside, the attackers' camps fared little better. Latrines dug in shallow pits spread disease, flies swarmed, and bodies of dead animals or fallen soldiers decayed nearby. Plague sometimes broke out, ending sieges abruptly as both sides suffered. The monotony of waiting was broken not by battle, but by illness sweeping through hungry, weary men. Morale and monotony. The greatest enemy in a siege was not always hunger or disease. It was despair. Inside walls, citizens wondered if relief would come. Outside, soldiers wondered if they would ever breach the defenses. To pass time, people found rituals. Defenders attended church services, praying for divine help. Soldiers outside sang songs, played dice, or carved wood. Commanders delivered speeches promising victory. But still, boredom returned, heavier than before. The hum of daily tasks, fetching water, grinding grain, stirring stews, patching tunics, filled the silence where battle was expected. Sieges became waiting games that eroded patience more than strength. A glimpse of tension. Every now and then, tension spiked. A sudden skirmish broke out at the walls. Arrows hissed, stones clattered, boiling water or pitch poured down. Siege engines rolled forward, their wooden frames groaning. For a few hours, chaos disrupted monotony. Then, just as suddenly, calm returned. The defenders patched holes, the attackers pulled back. Life resumed its slow grind. For every burst of violence, weeks of dull waiting followed. That is the true rhythm of a siege, tedium punctuated by brief flashes of danger. Closing thought. A siege was not only a contest of strength, but of endurance. It was a trial of patience, of dullness stretched into desperation. The walls stood silent, the camps huddled in smoke, and time itself became the heaviest burden. And yet, one question lingers. If both sides lived in such monotony and hardship, what strategies or shifts allowed one side to finally break the endless waiting? Was it through force, deception, or the slow hand of famine? The mechanics of pressure, tunnels, towers, and time. Engineering patience. If Section 1 showed you the tedium of waiting, Section 2 introduces the labor behind the monotony. Sieges were not merely soldiers sitting outside walls. They were engineers' contests of dirt, timber, stone, and sweat. The work was slow and exacting. Most of it was invisible to the enemy until it suddenly appeared. A trench closer to the wall, a mound of earth rising, or the shadow of a wooden tower inching forward. These were not dramatic charges, but the creeping progress of engineering under duress. The besiegers sought to reduce strong stone walls not by bold attack, but by steady erosion. Siege engines, groaning wood and heavy stones. The most recognizable tools of a siege were engines, catapults, trebuchets, mangonels. But these machines rarely dominated battles the way stories suggest. They were as much symbols of persistence as of destruction. The trebuchet, for example, required careful construction, often built on-site from timber hauled in wagons. Crews assembled huge wooden frames, hammering iron pins into place, ropes and hides forming the sling. For weeks, laborers worked as defenders watched from the walls. The first stone launched was less an act of violence than a punctuation mark after silence. Day after day, stones arced through the air, smashing against walls or into the town. They rarely shattered a fortress. Instead, they chipped away. Fragments of masonry fell, roofs splintered, citizens ducked under steady bombardment. The real impact was psychological. Life under bombardment meant waiting for the next crash, never knowing which house would suffer next. And when the machines broke, as they often did, work began anew: repairs, replacement, or patient adjustments. Even destruction was boring in its repetition. Mining the walls. One of the most feared yet tedious methods of siege was mining. Teams of sappers dug tunnels beneath the walls, propping them with timber beams. Once deep enough, they filled the chamber with combustibles, straw, wood, tar. The fire consumed the beams, collapsing the tunnel and undermining the wall above. This was slow, filthy work. Men crawled through dirt and mud, lungs filled with dust, listening for the defenders' countermines. Underground wars unfolded, not with swords, but with muffled shouts, pickaxes, and sudden collapses. Defenders often dug their own tunnels to intercept the attackers, leading to cramped, torchlit struggles underground. Even here, monotony ruled. Hours of digging, dripping water, creaking timbers. Only occasionally did a wall tremble and a section collapse, breaking the stillness with sudden ruin. Towers on wheels. If walls could not be broken from below, attackers built upward. Wooden siege towers, massive rolling structures, were inched toward the defenses. Inside, ladders and platforms allowed soldiers to climb higher than the parapets. At the top, a drawbridge could be lowered to meet the wall. Building one of these towers required forests of timber, teams of carpenters, and weeks of labor. All the while, defenders rained down arrows, stones, or fire. To protect the builders, hides soaked in water were draped over the structure. Smoke rose, water hissed, men labored on. Moving the towers was another trial of patience. Pushed by oxen or men, they creaked forward slowly across muddy ground. Sometimes they sank. Sometimes they caught fire anyway. Sometimes they never reached the wall. For every dramatic tale of a tower breaching defenses, countless others ended in immovable hulks rotting in the rain. Ramps, ditches, and earthworks. Not every siege relied on machines. Often the labor was simply moving earth. Attackers filled moats with stones and timber, then dug trenches closer to the walls. Defenders dug counter ditches, threw down sharpened stakes, or flooded low ground with water. Ramps were raised with baskets of dirt, each basket carried by weary soldiers. It took thousands of trips to pile a mound high enough to reach walls. The defenders watched, fired arrows, and dropped stones, but the ramp still grew, inch by inch. The siege became a contest of who could endure the labor longer. Inside the walls, countermeasures. While attackers built, defenders worked equally hard. Stone masons patched cracks in walls by candlelight. Buckets of sand and water were kept ready to extinguish fire. Cauldrons of water or tar boiled, not for sudden dramatic use, but as constant preparation. Archers shifted from tower to tower, watching for weak spots. Scouts leaned over battlements, listening for sounds of tunneling. In some sieges, drums or bowls of water were set on the ground to detect vibrations from sappers. Every creak in the night became suspect. For the defenders, the endless repetition of preparation was as dull as the waiting. Every day might bring an attack, yet most days brought only more waiting. The strain of time. The central feature of siege mechanics was time itself. Each wall battered, each trench dug, each tower moved closer marked a step forward. But each step took weeks. Defenders knew relief armies might arrive. Attackers knew supplies might run out. Time wore down stone and spirit alike. The most successful sieges often ended not in breached walls, but in negotiations. After months of pressure, towns surrendered from hunger, disease, or despair. The elaborate engines, the tunnels, the towers were as much tools of intimidation as of destruction. A closing question. When you imagine a siege, you might see fire, ladders, and broken gates. But for those who lived through them, it was more often the endless sound of hammering wood, digging earth, and stones thudding against walls. It was the dull grind of mechanics slowly applied against patience. Yet one question remains. If walls and defenses were always rebuilt, engines always repaired, and famine always a risk, why did rulers persist in siege warfare for centuries? Was it because the monotony itself was a weapon as strong as any sword? Starvation, surrender, and what remained? The slow creep of hunger. The true weapon of siege warfare was not the catapult or the tower, it was hunger. As weeks stretched into months, the granaries inside a castle emptied. Bread became thinner, baked with substitutes like acorn meal or ground bark. Ale was watered to the point of tastelessness. The smell of stale fish became constant. First went the luxuries: wine, spices, fresh meat. Then, as the weeks dragged on, horses and mules were slaughtered for food. Dogs, cats, and rats followed. Chroniclers speak of towns where boiled leather became broth, where weeds and grass were gathered from cracks in the stones. Hunger hollowed faces. Children cried at night, not from fear of arrows, but from empty bellies. The defenders' morale cracked one crumb at a time. The price of desperation. Some sieges became infamous for the extremity of their desperation. Chronicles whisper of cannibalism, though whether these tales were exaggerated by victorious armies or truthful accounts of horror is often debated. What is certain is that desperation made survival choices grim. For many, surrender seemed preferable to another day of gnawing hunger. The monotony of siege transformed into despair, not with sudden battle, but with a steady collapse of willpower. Negotiated ends. Despite the image of fiery conquest, most sieges ended quietly through negotiation. Once it was clear that food and morale were gone, the defenders would parley. Messengers carrying white flags approached the enemy camp, sometimes escorted by priests. Terms were hammered out: surrender in exchange for sparing lives, or safe passage for the garrison if the town was yielded. Commanders weighed their choices carefully. For attackers, a peaceful surrender preserved the town's wealth and walls. For defenders, it preserved their lives. It was not always granted. Harsh terms or massacres followed stubborn resistance. But more often, sieges ended with signatures and handshakes rather than final assaults. The sack of a town. When negotiation failed, the results were brutal. If attackers stormed the walls after months of waiting, discipline often collapsed. Soldiers unleashed their frustration in looting, violence, and destruction. The monotony of waiting erupted into sudden chaos. Houses were plundered, churches desecrated, markets overturned. Goods, grain, cloth, livestock were seized as spoils. Citizens were enslaved or ransomed. Chroniclers describe the aftermath as a place where silence returned only after smoke had drifted away, leaving ash where homes had stood. Even for the victors, the sack of a town was not pure triumph. Disease often spread among soldiers who feasted on spoiled food or drank foul water. Corpses in the streets carried plague into the same camp that had waited so long for victory. Aftermath inside the walls. For survivors, life after a siege was as monotonous as the siege itself, but heavier. The walls bore scars of bombardment. Houses leaned from cracks or collapsed entirely. Granaries were empty, wells fouled. Rebuilding began slowly. Stones were replaced, roofs repaired, markets reopened. But famine left its mark for years. Fields had lain untilled during the siege, cattle driven off, tools lost or broken. For peasants and townsfolk, the end of a siege did not mean freedom from struggle. It meant years of slow recovery. The fate of the attackers. Victory for attackers was rarely easy either. Months of waiting drained treasuries and consumed supplies. Armies grew restless, wages overdue. Mercenaries demanded their share of loot, and discipline broke when pay was delayed. Commanders carried the memory of attrition, calculating whether the prize had been worth the cost. Too often, victory was measured not in glory but in exhaustion. Lessons from monotony. If one theme runs through the history of sieges, it is that monotony was itself a weapon. The endless waiting, the rationing of food, the slow pressure of engineering, all were designed to break the rhythm of daily life until surrender became inevitable. Sieges reveal the power of patience in war. They show how much of conflict is not in the clash of arms, but in the endurance of hunger, thirst, and boredom. The grand stories of medieval battlefields fade when compared to the dull persistence of a siege. Closing reflection. Imagine months of waiting behind walls, the smell of stale bread, the sound of hammers on wood, the sight of enemy tents unmoving on the horizon. This was the essence of siege warfare, not glorious combat, but the quiet misery of endurance. And yet, one lingering question emerges. If siege warfare was so slow, so costly, and so draining to both sides, why did it remain the strategy of choice for centuries? Was it because in the end, nothing broke men and cities more effectively than the monotony of waiting?